Okay, it seems like we have a quorum of attendees, so I want to hop right in and thank everybody in advance for joining us today. Welcome to the Campaign Influence Best Practices presented by Full Circle. We're going to focus on a lot of different topics around measuring influence, so I thought we would organize the conversation by first offering a bit of context about Full Circle, then discuss some of the more commonly used and familiar attribution methodologies. From there, we'll move on to discuss some best practices around campaign influence and attribution that will allow your organization to not only measure and report on campaign data in the most accurate fashion, but also discuss the best ways to socialize this campaign influence data and get internal buy-in. As we know, influence is a relatively forward-thinking way to measure campaign performance. We're then going to put all of this in context by quickly discussing how Full Circle specifically tracks influence. And then at the very end, we'll be sure to break for questions that can be submitted through the chat function. So in advance, I kindly request that you write down your questions and save those for the end. Without further ado, I'd like to hop right in. And so I'd like to begin by offering a bit of context to our marketing solutions in our company. Full Circle is founded by ex-Salesforce executives and Salesforce technology consultants, and therefore we're intimately aware and familiar with many of the intricacies of the Salesforce platform and how to extend the existing functionality and reporting capabilities. What we have here is a highly flexible set of enterprise-grade marketing performance management solutions. And I emphasize the flexibility of these applications because obviously every organization has some unique processes, some unique funnel logic, as well as differing levels of configuration and customization within Salesforce. And so therefore, it was really important in creating this application, these different solutions, that we offered a highly flexible infrastructure to obviously accommodate all of this uniqueness across processes and configuration between different organizations. This slide right here is a product stack slide, really just to demonstrate where we fit into the marketplace. As I mentioned, we're a native Salesforce application. So we really sit right within your live production org of Salesforce as an additional layer to extend that reporting functionality, that accuracy, and visibility into all of your marketing data. That said, we also have great flexibility in terms of the different marketing automation vendors we work with. Some of the major players that we work with, you'll see across the top. We, of course, work with some of the smaller vendors like perhaps Silverpop or HubSpot as well, or Pardot. Organizationally, we're actually broken down into three main modules. And starting on the left side here, the response management module is really built out around that ability to report across both the lead and contact side of the database, and therefore better manage all of our different campaign responses, regardless of whether they represent a net new lead or whether they're coming from the existing contact side of the database. The funnel intelligence module in the center here is really focused on filling in the gaps in the higher stages of the funnel. So we have clarity from end to end into every stage within our funnel. With that, we're finally able to deliver core funnel metrics like volume and velocity and conversion rates. So with this, we can really offer extremely granular insight and understanding as to how every single campaign response moves through successive stages in the funnel. And then lastly, on the right side here, we have our campaign performance module. The campaign performance module is really focused around not only the re-architecture of the attribution methodology in Salesforce to ensure that we can do accurate ROI derivation, but also the extension of that is what we're going to be focusing on today, which is weighted campaign influence. And weighted campaign influence allows us to understand how every single campaign that has touched an opportunity has perhaps uniquely influenced that opportunity. And obviously, we'll dig into this topic in greater detail as we move on to the successive slides. So I wanted to certainly kind of present all of this information in a consumable fashion for those out there that are newer to the concepts of campaign influence. Therefore, we're going to begin by discussing some of the common campaign attribution methodologies. And before we dive in, I think it's really important to make the distinction between campaign attribution and campaign influence. Campaign attribution, simply put, is really seeks to credit a single campaign with driving an opportunity to close, while campaign influence instead allows us to look at every campaign on an opportunity and therefore understand how each campaign has uniquely impacted that deal. Therefore, campaign influence here is going to be inclusive of every single marketing touchpoint over the course of the entire sales cycle. Now, moving back to some of the common attribution methodologies, which keep in mind is seeking to designate complete credit to a single campaign. The first of these are the more common first or last touch methodologies, which typically is giving the first or last campaign associated with the opportunity 100% of the credit there. And while this methodology may be okay for those companies that are perhaps maybe focused on the source of the deal, or in the case of the last touch, perhaps they're focused more specifically on the most recent piece of collateral that they've sourced. Nonetheless, both these models have some significant limitations that we need to be aware of. First, both models offer no visibility into how other campaigns have played a role in creating or influencing that opportunity. There's also no guarantee that the campaign you give credit to was in fact a campaign that the person actually responded to. So a big limitation here is that many times the first or last touch campaign could perhaps be a campaign that is something the person never even saw or responded to, but still it's going to be receiving credit. And therefore, in some cases, we run into situations where campaigns will be inaccurately credited as the primary campaign on the opportunity. Another limitation is that obviously you can create some severe inaccuracies in your campaign performance reporting as it facilitates this inaccurate revenue attribution. In the case of the example on the screen, you'll notice that the single touch model credits either the inbound call or the event on April 23rd with 100% of the revenue credit, and therefore is not inclusive of all of the other campaigns that have potentially touched this opportunity over the course of the sales cycle. A second common attribution methodology is the multi-touch or even spread methodology. And this methodology gives every campaign associated with an opportunity equal amount of the revenue credit. And so while this serves as a really nice baseline and is a great way to begin to link all of our campaigns to revenue, it's still designating even credit to each campaign and is therefore not quite enough to really start gleaning true actionable insight from individual campaign performance. The obvious limitations here that not every campaign influenced the opportunity in the same way. One campaign may have influenced the opportunity creation, while another campaign heavily influenced the close of the deal. And therefore, we obviously cannot credit these campaigns the same amount as others on the opportunity. And why is that? Ultimately, it's because all campaigns are in reality not created equal. And that's why it's really important and really why we need weighted campaign influence in order to understand marketing's true contribution to revenue, in order to understand that influence of every single campaign that has perhaps touched the opportunity over the course of the sales cycle. Now, to explain weighted campaign influence in a bit greater detail, what it in effect does is it's ultimately breaking down the total opportunity amount and applying it down as a percentage of the total to each campaign on the opportunity. Now keep in mind the sum of each campaign's influenced revenue will always equal the total opportunity value, which ensures that our total influence revenue number and our actual revenue number will always equal one another and therefore is in fact relevant data for us to actually act on. As you can see in a few of these examples that we'll pull up right here, once we have all of this data specific to each opportunity, we can easily pull this into larger aggregate reports. And this is really where we begin to derive that key insight that we can then act on to really optimize our marketing practice, because this allows us to begin to view data across many different business dimensions and criteria that are important to you. As you can see, in this case, we're reporting on the influence data via campaign type to understand perhaps whether our banner ads are more productive versus our email campaigns that we run. In the case of this front metric right here, dashboard component, we'll notice that the email marketing is the most influential campaign type to the tune of over $15 million. That said, there are many additional ways to slice and dice and begin to consume this data. And so some additional examples here. For instance, we can also see things like how our campaigns have influenced deals across many sorts of dimensions, in this case, company size or market segment. But we could also look at it across perhaps industry type, marketing region, contact roles, product type. Basically, at a high level, the rule of thumb here is that any field that you guys track in Salesforce, we can then report on after the fact. So if you guys are in fact tracking something as mundane as eye color on your different prospects, we'll be actually able to slice and dice by that business dimension within our reporting. And while we can obviously report on all of this data by many different business dimensions and fields, we can also look at influence data specific to an opportunity, as demonstrated within this screenshot. After all, this campaign influence data is built on an opportunity by opportunity basis, and then it's run into larger aggregate reports that we look at. Now, you'll notice that within Full Circle's campaign influence product that we're looking at right now, that we allow you to run 3 different models out of the box and concurrently with one another. That said, we're also offering an SDK in the case that your team would like to build their own custom model. And as you may have noticed, and as I mentioned on the previous slide, because Full Circle allows you to run 3 different models concurrently with one another, which allows you to compare the different configured models and easily iterate on these over time, I wanted to therefore talk through some standard weighting methodologies for campaign influence. So, in many cases, it's a good way to begin by offering an even spread distribution model across all campaigns. And keep in mind, while we discussed this already, that this model still doesn't deliver us quite enough actionable insight to really begin driving confident decision making, because it in fact gives even credit to each campaign. It does serve a great purpose as a baseline to compare other influence models against. It also allows us to begin to link every different campaign we run to revenue, in the case that we've been focused purely on attribution in the past, which, keep in mind, seeks to credit a single campaign on an opportunity. Now, in many cases, for a smaller, less mature business or an organization with a shorter sales cycle, they may be primarily focused on understanding what the source of the deal is. And therefore, they'll want to favor the first campaign touch more significantly. And therefore, they would give that weight, or added weight to the first campaign touch there. In the case of more mature companies or companies with perhaps a longer sales cycle, they may instead favor perhaps that tipping point campaign that allows them to understand which campaign drove engagement by crediting that campaign with more influence relative to its peers. The advantage here is that we can run all 3 different models and therefore compare and iterate over time on these models' configuration as it applies to our marketing strategy and our business process. So at this point, I want to hop over into the application and give you a real look at the campaign influence feature and how it operates in a live production org of Salesforce. So bear with me one moment while I just pivot over to our demo environment. And so the first thing we're going to take a look at here is what's called our Deal Explorer feature. Essentially, the Deal Explorer is unique to Full Circle and really meant to aggregate key data points specific to an opportunity. So in the case that we have a really great opportunity that's high value and high velocity, we can understand, how can we replicate more of those opportunities in the future? Now, the reason we're looking at our Deal Explorer in the context of campaign influence is because you'll notice that it also allows us to understand the influence of every campaign specific to that opportunity and serves as a really good example to explain how we begin to configure these different models. Now, you'll notice in the top right-hand corner, we're visualizing our primary marketing touch points. And this is how standard Salesforce would typically do attribution methodology. Now, keep in mind, they typically leverage the last campaign touch, which means they credit that most recent campaign on the opportunity with driving the opportunity and therefore define it as the primary campaign. Now, keep in mind, this in some cases can create some inaccuracies because perhaps that last campaign touch could have been an email that bounced off the recipient and therefore something they never even saw or responded to. So instead, Full Circle seeks to define the primary campaign as instead the one that drove sales to engage with the lead or contact, pushed it to the marketing qualified stage. Now that we have accuracy across these 3 touch points, we can ensure that ROI derivation is always going to be accurate for us on our campaign performance. But keep in mind that ROI in Salesforce is singular in nature. It's assumptive that we want to give all the credit, to a specific campaign on an opportunity. And in reality, it's therefore excluding and not taking into account all of these other campaigns that potentially touch the opportunity. And so as a response to this, we created our weighted campaign influence, which in fact allows us to understand how each campaign associated to an opportunity has uniquely influenced that opportunity. And so, as you'll notice, and as I mentioned in the previous slide, our application allows you to run 3 different influence models concurrently with one another. But let's focus on the first model here and talk through the configuration of the first model. Let's imagine that we favor the primary campaign or the tipping point campaign more significantly, and therefore we want to give that campaign added credit. When we configured this first influence model, we'd first go into the primary marketing touchpoints and in fact give that primary campaign perhaps added weight relative to the first or last touch campaign. Then we'd go over to the contact role configuration section and we'd perhaps give the decision maker on the opportunity added weight relative to less weight to the technical influencer. Once the weighting of the model is all configured, the models run in the background and apply themselves down to every opportunity we have in Salesforce. And what's happening is the models are breaking down the total opportunity value and applying them down as a percentage of the total to each campaign that has touched this opportunity. Now you'll notice that one of the campaigns in the first influence model here is actually receiving the majority of the dollar amount credit. The reason for that is, if we look up, this banner ad is in fact the primary campaign on the opportunity. And because when we configured the first model, we gave that primary campaign source added weight, the model has then allocated additional dollar amount down to that specific campaign. So this serves as an example as to how we're beginning to arrive at these differing dollar amounts across each campaign in an effort to understand which campaigns have had more influence on the opportunity versus which campaigns have had less influence on the opportunity. Now, what you may be saying to yourself right now is that, well, obviously this is great, but all of this data is specific to a single opportunity. And you're right. All of this data becomes increasingly valuable when we look at it in larger aggregate reports. And so let's actually pivot over to a dashboard on influence so we begin to visualize some different ways that we're delivering this insight. And so looking at this dashboard, the first thing I want to scroll down to is at the bottom. And you'll notice relative to the three different models that we're running, we can understand which campaigns are most influential on our closed revenue at the top here. But then below that, we can also look at which campaigns are most influential on our open pipeline. So right off the bat, we're able to begin to break apart which campaigns are more influential on closed revenue versus our open pipeline. Now, as we scroll back to the top, I want to focus on the top right-hand component here. And within this component, you'll notice that we've inserted an additional business dimension, which is campaign type. So now we're looking at influence by campaign type to understand which campaign types, whether it be emails or banner ads or telemarketing, is driving the most influence in our revenue. And within this top component, you'll notice that our green email marketing right here is actually influencing the majority of our revenue to the tune of over $4 million. But as we scroll down, you'll notice that we've inserted an additional business dimension, in this case, company size. And so now we're still looking at which campaign types are most influential. We're just looking at that relative now to the enterprise space, the mid-market, and the small business sectors, all of which we sell to. And again, we'll see our email marketing in green is the most influential campaign type and is located in the enterprise sector, which is obviously our sweet spot here. Now, if we scroll down one more component, this is where it gets interesting. As you'll notice, now we're looking at proportional influence. So we're not tying influence to dollar amount, but actually the percentage of revenue it influences in each market space. And true to the above stories, again, email marketing in green is influencing the majority of our enterprise revenue. But if we look at our banner ads in purple, while we notice that it's very insignificant on total influenced revenue in the enterprise space, it all of a sudden becomes the most influential campaign type in the mid-market and is still heavily influential in the small business sector as well. And so this is a really great example of how we can begin to derive some key insight so we can better engage with companies of different sizes based on which campaign types we know to resonate with them the best. And so this is a great example of some just initial ways that we can begin to really understand and visualize our campaign influence data. Some other additional dimensions that a lot of our customers choose to employ may be perhaps by by product type. In that case, that report would show us which campaign types are most influential on the sale of our different products or services that our business sells. We could also look at it by account region. And what that would show us is which campaigns are most influential in driving sales specific to the different regions that we market to. This is hugely valuable in the case that you're actually organized by a marketing organization broken down by regions, or in the case that you have field marketing reps out there, because obviously they can be really strategic in the way they invest their dollars, obviously in campaigns they know to drive sales specific to their region. So I want to hop back over into our slide deck. So bear with me while I pivot back into the slide deck real quickly. So hopefully you've liked what you've seen so far. And now I want to talk about how we can get started and up and running with Full Circle's campaign influence. Well, the process is actually pretty simple. Full Circle's weighted campaign influence product is actually available right now via the App Exchange. We also offer a free trial. And once it's downloaded, it's very, very easy to build these models and then define your weighting and then run the models and then iterate on them over time so you can begin to refine them in line with your business process and your marketing strategy. The brilliant thing about campaign influence is that it's not only very easy to install and implement and manage, as it has very little effect or bearing on existing processes, it also isn't tied to our funnel logic or existing usage of Salesforce. And therefore, it's not going to impact any of the other departments, any of the other current people that are using the application, any of the other add-ons that you have within Salesforce. And so lastly, before we end and open it up for questions, I want to leave you with a quick case study so you can leave with a good example of how an organization has employed this campaign influence technology and in turn been able to really optimize their marketing activity. And so this company here on the screen represents a high-tech customer of ours in the mid-market space that had some major disagreement over the value of their trade shows for their overall business. And while the VP of sales was continually pressuring the VP of marketing to spend more on these trade shows and events, the VP of marketing was hesitant because they ultimately had no idea if in fact these trade shows were contributing to pipeline or revenue. Because he had no insight into how they performed on an individual level or, in aggregate, he was ultimately really uncomfortable with acting on intuition and gut feel. And so, prior to using campaign influence from Full Circle, they obviously were utilizing the first or last touch attribution, which gave 0 credit to the trade show campaigns, because typically they were simply allocating credit to that first touch or that last touch and ignoring all the campaigns that occurred in the middle of the sales cycle. And therefore, within the common attribution methodology, the VP of marketing couldn't understand whether or not those trade shows and those events were in fact helping to drive revenue. Now, after implementing Full Circle's campaign influence, you can see that they were able to account for every campaign that has touched the opportunity and therefore saw that trade shows were in fact a very influential campaign type, which prompted them to reallocate additional budget accordingly to those specific trade shows, which in turn resulted in increased revenue for them. And so this really serves as a great example of how a business was able to not only quickly implement a technology, but also derive key insight immediately and then optimize their marketing portfolio and practice in order to drive revenue, which at the end of the day is all of our goals. And so lastly, before we open it up for questions, I wanted to talk through some different recommendations to get your organization talking about and socializing campaign influence internally. Because as I mentioned, this is very much a new way to measure campaign performance. And therefore, it's beneficial to understand how to best socialize this for your organization. So the first recommendation we'd offer would be to be aware of your current attribution methodologies. Understand whether or not you're using that first touch or that last touch attribution methodology, and more importantly, understand the limitations behind that. Secondly, we suggest that you socialize the idea of weighted campaign influence across the marketing and sales organizations, because keep in mind, in some cases, this is going to be new to organizations and requires them to really warm up to the idea of attributing credit across every different campaign that has touched an opportunity. The third recommendation would be to familiarize yourself with our 30-day trial on campaign influence, which is available via the App Exchange. What the free trial allows you to do is install into your live production org and therefore pull 10 different opportunities and begin to derive campaign influence based on 10 of your own opportunities, which in effect allows you to begin to visualize all of this campaign influence data in the context of your own data within your own live production org. And the fourth recommendation would be, after you download the free trial, connect with us for a complimentary consultation on which influence models work best for you. During this consultation, we'll not only help to ensure that you've gotten the package installed correctly and that everything's working appropriately, we'll also talk through those best practice recommendations on how to configure each model. And that obviously will allow you to have a much faster path to success with this free trial and perhaps ultimately the live product. And so now at this point, we've approached the end of our presentation here. I want to open it up for questions. So in the case that you have any questions, please feel free to submit those through the chat function now. Okay. And so right off the bat, we have a question around the granularity of the campaign influence data, and that's a great question. They're wondering if we can actually access the data on a response-by-response basis that's supporting all of that campaign influence data, and the answer is yes. Within our applications, we allow you to drill down into the specific campaign and see every single campaign response that's ultimately driving those different campaign influence metrics. And what this allows you to do is not only understand how you've arrived at different campaign influence numbers, but also explain to others, perhaps executives that you're presenting this info to, how you arrived at those specific metrics. And in doing so, that helps to foster a lot of confidence because you're ultimately proving the accuracy of the metrics you deliver. Any other questions? We have another question regarding Marketo integration. That's a really good question. And I'll start at a high level and say that we have great flexibility, as I mentioned on one of the earlier slides, in terms of the different marketing automation vendors we work with. That said, we don't really require a true integration in a sense. All we really require to productively work with all of these different marketing automation vendors is that the marketing automation vendor makes campaign association to the new lead when it's pushed into Salesforce. And with that, as long as we have campaign association to the new lead, we can obviously understand where it came from as a result perhaps of this Marketo Nurture program. And then we can track it all the way through the funnel in Salesforce and understand where it goes. And in the case that it closes in a closed deal, we can obviously credit that campaign appropriately. Any other questions out there? Please feel free. We have another question. This is a really good one. We have a question around best practices in the configuration of the 3 different models. And I'm happy to answer this, but obviously this is going to be unique business to business. So I do encourage you to reconnect with us for that consultation in the event that you download the free trial, and then we can more specifically address which different models are going to be best for your business. But a high level, the recommendation we typically make is that you start with the first model in line with your current attribution methodology. So in the case that you're using that first touch attribution methodology, then we suggest that you configure that first campaign influence model in line with that, which will in effect give all credit to that first touch campaign. Then we suggest that the second campaign influence model be configured in that even spread. And keeping in mind the limitations around the even spread, because ultimately, they're not offering a considerable amount of insight in terms of, which campaigns were more influential than others. The even spread does really importantly serve as a great baseline that we can compare our other influence models to. It also is a great starting point for beginning to link all of your different campaigns to revenue in a multi-touch fashion. So in the case that campaign influence is new to your organization, you're beginning to try and socialize it internally, this is really a consumable stack to allow your people to easily understand where they've been in the past relative to their attribution model, and then where we're moving to in the future relative to these campaign influence model that distribute the revenue across every single campaign. And then the recommendation on the third model is going to be in line with really your business and your marketing practice. So perhaps in the third model, we want to get really aggressive and favor the tipping point campaign that's driving sales engagement more significantly than the first or last touch campaign. And so as you notice, by configuring the first model with that specific attribution methodology that you're currently using, maybe it's the first touch attribution, and then the second model in that even multi-touch spread that gives even credit across every campaign on the opportunity, and then the third model, which would instead favor maybe one of those campaign touches more so than the others. And this offers a really consumable stack so people can begin to really easily understand where you've been in the past in terms of how we attribute revenue to different campaigns and where we're moving to in the future, which is weighted campaign influence allowing us to understand how every single campaign on an opportunity has influenced that opportunity uniquely. So hopefully that was clear. Are there any other questions out there? And of course, in the case that anyone has questions as they kind of reflect and debrief in the coming days, I do encourage you to email me directly, and I can address those on a need basis. My direct email is jay@fullcirclecrm.com. I apologize for not introducing myself at the beginning of the session, but my name is Jay Jennison. I'm the Corporate Accounts Manager here at Full Circle, and therefore can act as your technical resource to any additional questions that you have regarding our different products. It looks like we're out of questions, and so as I mentioned, please feel free to follow with additional questions that come up. I want to thank everybody for their time today and wish everyone a really good day. Thanks.